Hello, and welcome to a new series I'm beginning on this channel, focusing on the Irish rebellions of the 17th century, and the wider context which made them possible. I'm going to be starting more or less afresh here, so if you've only just found my channel, this is as good a place as any to start. I'd of course recommend that you go back and watch my playlist on the decline of Gaelic Ireland if you haven't, but it's not essential viewing for this narrative. I'm going to begin with a walkthrough of the political situation in Ireland in the early to middling 17th century. The outlook for anyone who wasn't a Protestant was a grim one. The so-called New English settlers were the only people who were trusted by the Crown to govern in Ireland, based simply on the fact that they were Protestant and less vulnerable to intrigues from Catholic kingdoms on the continent, such as France and Spain. If you were a Catholic, regardless of your record of loyalty down the years, you were not worthy of trust by the English crown. Any one of England's Catholic subjects could be a puppet of the Pope, waiting for an opportunity to cause damage to England and its territories. The contempt that Catholic subjects were held in by the crown meant that the Old English, otherwise known as the Anglo-Normans, and the Gaelic Irish, at last had something in common with one another. Both groups were bound together by the discriminatory laws and policies of the Protestant-dominated government, even though in the past these two factions had often opposed one another. The government made an effort to keep Catholics out of important positions, such as posts in the army, the judiciary, and most importantly, Parliament. This slight stung the Old English in particular, as they'd been among the first settlers in Ireland, and felt that they deserved more respect. Measures such as recussancy fines further pressurised the Catholic population and generated more ill feeling. Recussancy fines were essentially a tax that could be levied upon anyone who refused to practice Protestant worship, be they Catholic, Calvinist, or anything else. Even with all this discrimination, though, most of the upper-class Catholic gentry would have been happy to be peacefully integrated into the English system, if only to get their old privileged positions back. Unfortunately for them, the New English Protestants had a vested interest in maintaining their stranglehold on Parliament and the other institutions of government. At every turn, the Protestant population attempted to keep the Catholics locked out of important positions. In addition to this, they continually challenged the validity of land titles held by Catholics, citing things like the backward medieval nature of the titles and pointing out that the owners refused to attend Protestant services. This bloodless war on Catholicism in Ireland could well have developed into yet another outbreak of violence on the island, had it not been for the proposal of a new policy known as the Graces. The Graces were a series of reformative legislation that was put forward to King Charles I by some of the wealthier Catholics who sat on the Irish House of Lords. These reforms were aimed at reducing the exclusionary and unfair laws that were at this time making life for Catholics very difficult. King Charles allowed some of the requests, such as relaxing the exclusion of many Catholics from Parliament, and allowing them to keep hold of their land. In return, Charles's Catholic subjects would pay a special tax that would prop up the English treasury ahead of the war that Charles would declare on Spain in 1625. Ultimately, however, this would prove to be a only temporary solution to Catholic discontent. This was largely due to the actions of Thomas Wentworth, who was made Lord Deputy of Ireland in 1632. Wentworth's main goal was to ensure that Ireland was a profitable possession for King Charles. The English treasury was, as ever, in dire need of cash flow, and Ireland was often more of a burden to it than anything else. When the Irish Parliament sat in 1634, Wentworth's first proposed tax bill passed smoothly, as the Catholic MPs had already agreed to pay the extra tax included in the Graces, which by now had reached a total of 51 proposed reforms. The Graces themselves were scheduled to be deliberated upon in Parliament's second session, between the 4th of November and the 14th of December. Hopes that they would be implemented in full were increased, as the Catholic MPs actually held a brief majority in Parliament due to the unexpected absence of several Protestant MPs. Wentworth had other ideas, though, and on November 27th, he refused to implement two of the proposed Graces reforms. These were to extend the English statute of limitations to Ireland, and, significantly, to guarantee the titles of many landowners in Ulster, the majority of which were Catholic. As Lord Deputy, Wentworth had the final word on the matter, due to the Poynings Law of 1494. Furious at this development, the Catholic MPs resolved to oppose all of Wentworth's future bill proposals, regardless of what they were. Wentworth wrote to Chief Justice Edward Coke, saying, "The Popish party have been ill to please this session, but after I had, the 27th of last month, given our answer to their graces, they lost all temper." Following the Catholic outrage at Parliament, the graces were shelved for a time, and Wentworth began to accrue an even worse reputation among the Catholics of Ireland, as his new policies became more and more discriminatory and money-hungry. One of the things he was most hated for was his consistent challenging of the validity of Catholic landholdings, often confiscating them and holding the land hostage in exchange for large fines. This was all in accordance with his main goal of wringing as much money out of the country as possible in order to fund the English treasury. While the actions of Wentworth undoubtedly contributed to the bloodshed to come, they were not solely responsible for it. The spark that led to the uprising in Ireland came about as a result of the instability across the sea in Scotland. Just like the Catholics in Ireland, the Scottish had their own grievances with the English policies. The cause for discontent in Scotland was, like so much else in this period, of religious origin. The Church of Scotland, otherwise known as the Kirk, was of the Presbyterian type, meaning that they had little use for official roles such as bishops like those seen in the Church of England. Some in the Kirk felt that the Protestant practice was not really so far removed from Catholicism, with the lack of fealty to the Pope being the only perceived difference. When Charles I tried to impose a uniform religious doctrine between the Church of England and Scotland in 1637, great upset resulted, as many Scots felt their religious freedom was being trampled. This move by Charles led to the wholesale rejection of Church of England doctrinal practice in Scotland by the National Covenanters in 1638. This group would become known to history as the Scottish Covenanters. All bishops were expelled from the Kirk, much to the dismay and anger of Charles I. Charles decided that a display of force was required to cow the Scots into obedience. The plan that Charles devised had plenty of moving parts, consisting of several armies moving as one, with an end goal of linking up in Scottish territory. The largest contingent was a force of 20,000 men, which was to march northwards from England in the direction of Edinburgh. Meanwhile, the Marquis of Hamilton led an amphibious landing with 5,000 troops that was to come ashore at Aberdeen. The final piece of the puzzle was an Irish force, originating in Ulster under Randall MacDonald, the Earl of Antrim, which was to invade western Scotland and aim to join forces with royalist Scottish clans such as the MacDonalds. Things began to go wrong almost straight away, however, as the two smaller forces in the operation ran into difficulties. The Marquis of Hamilton and his 5,000-strong amphibious force were beaten to Aberdeen by James Graham, the first Marquess of Montrose. He occupied the town ahead of Hamilton's landing, and made sure it was impossible for the Marquis to bring his troops ashore. The Irish element of the force under MacDonald simply never materialised, leading to further difficulties for Charles. Not to be discouraged, however, the main English army marched to the Scottish border and mustered at the town of Berwick-upon-Tweed. While numerous, the actual troops of the English army were of very poor quality man for man. Many of them were conscripts from the northern militias, and plenty of them had no arms but simple bows and arrows, a somewhat outdated weapon in the age of pike and shot. The Covenanters came to meet this threat on their southern border with an army of 16,500 men, which was led by an experienced officer corps that had seen plenty of battle on the continent. Charles himself travelled to Berwick in the wake of his army, and arrived there on the 30th of May to issue a proclamation. As long as the Scottish Covenanter army remained 10 miles north of the border, he would not invade Scotland. The Covenanter forces under Alexander Leslie continued to advance, but stopped at Kelso, roughly 10 miles from the border. Neither side particularly wanted to fight, and negotiations ensued between the Covenanters and Charles. On the 19th of June, a peace was agreed, which became known as the Pacification of Berwick. Charles agreed that all disputed questions regarding the enforcement of Church of England law in Scotland should be referred to a General Assembly or to the Parliament of Scotland. The Scottish Parliament seized its opportunity to enact new legislation and completely abolished the use of bishops in the Kirk, and declared itself free from royal control. Charles concluded that this move must have been conducted with support from French intriguers, and called Parliament to gather their support for a second invasion. The first so-called Bishops' War had been declared without permission from Parliament, as the English aristocracy had not really wanted to fight. Now Charles hoped that the threat of French interference would galvanise them. However, before voting on whether or not to support Charles's new war, the Parliament sought to work out some grievances that they had with Charles's policies, particularly with the royal prerogative to collect ship money. This was a tax that the king could implement without the approval of Parliament, and was generally levied on coastal areas. However, in the early 1630s, Charles had tried to make it payable by inland residents as well, causing much anger. Charles decided that these terms were unacceptable, and in 1640 he dissolved the Parliament. This was a move that would come back to bite him in future. Without the support of Parliament, Charles needed a different way to fund his expedition. Thomas Wentworth, who I have mentioned already, embarked on a campaign of fund hunting in both England and Ireland, earning the hatred of landed gentry in both kingdoms. Before Charles could invade Scotland, however, the Covenanters marched over the River Tweed, and the English army was forced to retreat before them. The Scots soon overran Northumbria and Durham, and on the 28th of August 1640, the Battle of New Bern was fought between Alexander Leslie and the Covenanters and Lord Conway. The Scots hugely outnumbered their royalist opponents, and Conway was defeated in short order. Following this victory, the Covenanters occupied Newcastle, gaining control of most of London's coal supply. Charles was forced to leave the two northern counties he had lost in the hands of the Scots, and agree to pay the expenses of the occupying enemy army. He simply had no other choice. The Treaty of Ripon was agreed, and Charles was forced to call Parliament again in order to procure the necessary funds to pay the expenses of the Scottish armies occupying his former territory. This was a huge blow to the prestige of the king, and he would never really recover from it. Unfortunately, the sitting MPs were still angry about the fiasco of the previous Parliament session, which had lasted only 3 weeks before Charles dissolved it. During this new session, the MPs spent their time attacking Charles's administration. Many of his chief supporters, such as Thomas Wentworth and the Archbishop of Canterbury William Laud, were impeached and then executed. Charles was eventually able to secure peace with the Scots, with the Treaty of London, the terms of which were not at all in his favour. The Scots received a huge payout of £300,000, as well as the return of all ships and equipment captured by the English during the fighting. All attempts to enforce Protestant doctrine in Scotland were halted, and the Scottish Presbyterians were allowed what essentially amounted to total religious freedom. You can imagine the sort of excitement the victory of the Covenanters caused in the Irish Catholic community. The Scots had gone to war against the king to protect their right to practice their religion, and had received generous concessions for doing so. Some began to think that it might yet be possible for Catholics to achieve the same in Ireland. Next episode, I'll be talking about the rise of the Catholic Confederacy, and following along as the fruits of Charles's bad treatment of Parliament ripen into the devastating English Civil War. The War of the Three Kingdoms is on the way, and it'll be bloody in the extreme. Stay tuned for the next episode in this series, where I'll be returning to the goings-on in Ireland as the Catholic population makes its bid for religious freedom. As always, you can email me at keanrowanyt@gmail.com, and you can find my blog at www.irishhistoricalstudies.blogspot.com. If you have any questions about anything I've covered in this episode, please leave me a comment and we can have a discussion about it. Also, if you've spotted anything that sounded off, don't hesitate to tell me, and I'll try to have it cleaned up as soon as possible. Thank you for listening.